Hello, good day everybody. Today we're going to review a motherboard replacement on a Dell Optiplex 7060 small form factor desktop. As you review this replacement with me, realize that a lot of these Optiplex desktops are generally the same process, right? Even though they have a slightly different design, you're going to see it's generally the same procedure. Most of them have drive assembly on the top here. Just push that lever over a little bit and it unlocks it and you pivot it out. It's going to have a couple of SATA cable connectors to the motherboard, one for your solid state drive that you can see there. There's going to be one for the optical drive, and then the power cable to the motherboard. Removing both DIMMs. As you can see, we got two DIMMs in this particular model. Oftentimes you'll find a SATA cable that's not plugged into anything, that's just kind of hanging out there in case you put a second drive in. Just going to go remove the various connectors around. There's your motherboard power. There's front power button connector. And then a CPU power in the back there by the CPU heatsink. Removing the heatsink fan. Kind of remove the cables from the cable management clips that are around the chassis. Now I'm going to start to remove my heatsink. 4 screws holding your heatsink in. You'll see as you unscrew these, you'll hear them click eventually. When they click, that usually means that it's clear of the threads. You know, it's no longer holding. So we get those out, and then you can just pull straight up and remove that heatsink out of the way. This is a little cable connector for your chassis side door indicator. It's got the button there. When your side cover's off, it'll throw an alarm or an alert that your chassis cover's not on. This front bracket sits on top of your front USB ports. Single screw, and that bracket will anchor out. Now we're going to start to remove our anchor screws holding your motherboard in. I'm giving it a little tug here and I see that something's still holding it, and I found that's the tower bolt there that helps lock in the drive assembly cage that I removed at the beginning of the video. And then I've got a little mounting screw here for the an M.2 solid state drive, which did not have an M.2 drive in there, but sometimes you have those mount screws in there that if you were ever to add one, you could certainly put one in the M.2 slot that's there. And out comes the motherboard. Now, usually what I'll do right here is I'll set the new motherboard up nearby. I'll have it in the same direction or orientation as the old one, and then I'll just move the processor from one processor slot to the next. Make sure I put it in oriented the correct way. If you're not able to do that, you can just use the arrow indicators on the motherboard and the processor. You'll see when I bring the old processor over, I'm kind of pointing to the arrow that's in the bottom left corner, and it lines up with the arrow that's on the motherboard. Make sure you put your processor in the right way. If you get it in backwards, it could damage the processor and or motherboard. We're going to go ahead and take our alcoholic chem pad and clean off the thermal grease, the old thermal grease off the processor and off of the heatsink. Make sure they're nice and clean. And you bring the new motherboard down into your chassis. Usually the ports that are on the back side will anchor in first. And I'm being careful not to pinch any cables. I want to make sure all of my cable connectors are going to be on top of the board as I bring it into place. Once you get everything clear, it'll just drop right in place. You'll see all the anchor screw holes will line up perfectly, and you'll tell when it's seated the way it should be. So I put my M.2 anchor screw back in here, and then I start to put in my anchor screws around the perimeter of the motherboard. You see I'm pointing out at this point here, I'm pointing out a little arrow. A lot of these motherboards are going to have an arrow indicating where your anchor screws go. Sometimes there's more holes than, and you can get a little confusing on where to reinsert your anchor screws, so make sure you follow the arrow indicators. You're not going to over tighten these screws, you're just snugging them up, right? Never over tighten on electronics, you can damage the circuitry in the board. We're going to put our front bracket back in. It covers our front USB ports. Single screw goes back in on the right side there. I'm going to reconnect my various connectors. This is the front power button connector. A lot of these motherboards, it's just going to be taking mental note when you're disconnecting, making sure that you're remembering where everything goes. It's not rocket science on these. You don't have a whole lot of options on where to plug stuff in, so it's pretty self-explanatory on where everything goes back in. There's my CPU connector, CPU power. I got my motherboard power down between my fingers there. That's already in. Here's my chassis side cover indicator, plugging that back in. I'm going to apply some new thermal grease on the processor. Don't overdo it. You don't need a lot. You really just need a little dot, but I go a little bit more generous than a little dot. I want to make sure that it's enough to cover the entire processor. So before I bring the heatsink in, I'm going to plug in the fan first. If you try to do the fan afterwards, it's a real tight squeeze. So plug your fan in, bring your heatsink in place, line up the 4 heatsink screws. These are labeled 1 through 4, so you want to tighten them in that order. Dell's recommendation is to screw in the first number 1 halfway. So I bring this one in halfway, then I move to number 2, and I screw that one in all the way. Once I get number 2 in all the way, I go back to 1 and finish tightening that one off. Then I'll go tighten 3 and 4. What this does is it allows the thermal paste to more evenly spread across the processor. If you were to tighten one all the way, it might squeeze all that thermal paste out one side and not give you an even distribution of the paste. Going to reinsert my memory DIMMs. These DIMMs are in the banks indicated with the white clips. That's your bank 0 and 1. Black ones are going to be 2 and 3. I'm just going to, since we only have 2, we're going to put them in 0 and 1, both the white ones. Make sure those clips are spread out. You get the processor seated down in there. You just push straight down on both sides evenly until they snap in place. Now with that done, the last thing to put in is our our drive assembly. I realized that I'd forgot to connect I missed a little connector there. Get that one in place. Sometimes before you put this in, you want to get your connections in place because they sit directly underneath. So I'm going to do some cable management here, putting the power cable, the SATA cables, all onto this little management clip here. Most of the time they're color coded. Blue goes into your blue connector. On this one, your orange, which comes from your optical drive, goes into the white connector. And here's the power for your drives. Once we get that in, the two clips on the right side are gonna insert, and then you'll anchor it down. Once you get it in place, you push that little clip over and it locks it in. Most Optiplexes that are like this are similar. Front cover goes on, put the 3 clips in first, and then snap the top 3 clips in place, and then on goes your top cover. And that's it. Hope you liked this video. Hope it was helpful. Feel free to comment if you have any questions. Feel free to subscribe as well if you find these videos helpful. We're adding new videos regularly. Hope to see you again soon. Thanks.